This is a much more theoretical paper, The Influence of Dualistic Hegemonic Perceptions on Psychological Development in the Italian Diaspora, because I don't know, are there any other psychologists among us? I always feel there are very few of us at these conversations. The concept of hegemony is currently a much discussed area of scholarship. The term is not new. We just heard about Gramsci. For Gramsci via the Marxists in his prison notebooks, this was part of his criticism of capitalism due to its entrenched control of society through political, economic, and ideological coercion as well as violence. This discourse focuses on cultural hegemony, whereas the arguments discussed herein will look at this societal dimension effect of what I call psychic hegemony. Language, for example, is a recurrent theme in this research, and it's conducted looking at how migrants use language when they come to a country and how language changes in the receiving communities. Much study has been done in China, for example. As urban centers have grown beyond their limits, China's system of modernization and development is increasingly changing rural areas in many ways. One aspect is the use of standardized Chinese in place of the indigenous languages of those communities. This is similar to the adoption of standardized Italian replacing the local dialects of Italy. In cultural psychology, as understood by those who pursue the field, the view of culture itself is unfortunately based on the assumption that a culture is a unified organic totality. I often wonder if these folks have ever even been to another culture. As Said wrote in Orientalism, 40 years ago, is the notion of a distinct culture a useful one? This faulty thinking contributes to the assumption that cultures need to be unified to include shared language, religion, foodways, and so on. The migrants of today's diaspora differ from earlier ones who viewed assimilation in a positive light. As Goyal reminds us, scholarly literature on the new diasporas emphasize three key differences from earlier forms of migration. It is largely voluntary rather than coerced. It is connected to globalization, and it results from the failure of the post-colonial state. Despite these differing reasons for motivating the newer diasporas and the emphasis on agency, the older assumptions that include the need to adapt to the existing cultural hegemony persist. These are frequently a source of conflict between older and newer immigrant groups. When immigration laws began to emerge in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, this was a key typology, the old immigrants and the new immigrants, with the new immigrants arriving from southern parts of Europe and Eastern Europe. They were not only inferior to earlier immigrant groups, but they posed a threat to American societal structure who could not be integrated into the American way of life, its cultural hegemony. The irony is that now, 100 plus years later, the descendants of those supposedly deficient immigrants want to limit newer diasporas. What underlies much of this is a sense of hegemonic privilege, whether conscious or unconscious. The effects of hegemonic privilege on the development of identity in the Italian diaspora, or any place where there is a growing migrant community, have profound consequences for achieving identificational assimilation. There are two components that must be considered from a psychological perspective which influence the development of personal identity. First are the aspects of hegemonic privilege forced upon the individual from outside the self. These aspects include matters related to identity politics, particularly as these affect the immigrant experience and the matter of prevailing cultural norms that govern social discourse. The second component has to do with how the person integrates those views of privileged culture in both the development of the self and the creation of self-identity. This happens in psychological development for all individuals, regardless of migration status. But when an individual migrates, the process is unavoidably complicated and often exigent. The disjunction between the adopted culture and its values vis-a-vis those in the minoritized communities is a factor in current models of developmental and social psychology related to psychic well-being. This can help us better understand how the psychological self is affected within a transnational context, and how the difficulties encountered in the changing of cultures can be mitigated in the process of self-identity development. There are dualistic perceptions to consider regarding the effects of hegemonic privilege in the development of self-identity. There are the aspects of hegemonic privilege forced upon the individual from outside the self. Then there is how the individual integrates the views of the privileged culture in both overall psychological development and, again, more specifically in the creation of self-identity. Stereotypes created through cultural hegemony fit into this paradigm, and they are often frequently accepted by the targeted group as true and immutable. Many become traditions or accepted aspects of the derided ethnicity that become valued through time. Given their origins, stereotypes are a product of privilege and control that are used to simplify the social environment. All stereotypes lead to social categorization, which is one of the reasons for prejudiced attitudes. It becomes a them versus us mentality that leads to in-groups and out-groups. There are varieties of stereotypes that reference Americans of Italian heritage, as there are those specific to Australians of Italian heritage. One can put these stereotypes into categories: family, food, appearance, comportment, employment, crime. All these classifications and stereotypes are interconnected with the media because this is the place where they reach a significant audience and eventually become a part of a comprehensive mindset. Those related to crime are especially detrimental because they prey upon people's fear of the other, and they fuel a thrust towards violence as a means of defense. To quote Potter and Kapler from The Harms of Crime Media, the irony of all this is that our fears, prejudices, stereotypes, and pervasive impulses towards meanness and retribution are something less than real. They are created, mediated images offered to us as news and entertainments by a handful of immense and very motivated global corporations bound to state power. Again, this is why Italy and the United States can be taken together as sources of exerting hegemonic privilege, influenced by the global corporations who use media techniques and platforms to communicate the information of their choosing. Once a particular story is headlined by one of the major news outlets, all of the news outlets pick it up. There is a substantial research literature to support the relationship between media portrayals of crime and the fear that this incites. The increase in the reporting of crime news, crime as entertainment, together with the increase in shows about crime, have blurred the distinction between fact and fiction. The way crime news is reported must be considered as well. Where once the sensational crime stories were the specialty of the tabloids, mainstream newspapers and broadcast news outlets are using such stories for headlines and lead stories. And the representation of those committing the crimes is focused on individuals from the lowest socioeconomic backgrounds and often focus on ethnic minority status. A more insidious influence of the mafia than the one we tend to think about is its influence in this way on legitimate businesses. According to Champarache, mafia investments in the legal economy and mafia entrepreneurship are also an underestimated source of latent conflict that is costly to the economy and society. Yet we rarely hear about this aspect of the mafia in the news media. Although she does not address the notion of cultural hegemony per se, her description of what occurs demonstrates this is what she states: acknowledging the capacity of the mafiosi to become rule producers, thanks to their productive presence on legal markets, also raises the issue of competing sovereignties and the capacity of organized groups to become a surrogate of the state, with the ability to create and enforce rules. Yet in the media, we only hear about shootings, killings. We don't hear about the most insidious effects of the mafia. When crime fiction is analyzed across the media today, the emphasis is still on violent crime. Murder, assault, rape. Rape in fiction in books or film is usually committed by violent, psychopathic strangers, rather than intimate acquaintances of the victim, which is much more likely. This insistence on violent crime occurs because property crime, which rarely includes any interaction between the perpetrator and the victim, is actually very dull. Imagine a Law and Order episode that focuses on the theft of your iPad when you got up to get your organic brown sugar for your pumpkin spice latte. Beyond the portrayal of the crimes themselves is the portrayal of the criminals, where ethnicity, race, class, and gender are emphasized in ways that reinforce stereotypes, often in what is designated in psychology as something called earned reputation. Earned reputation is a lived stereotype. The drunken Irishman, the Korean math whiz, the Australian who really does drink Fosters and then wrestle a crocodile. This is applied to both the perpetrators and the victims. Hence, a woman who is raped is judged by what she did to cause the assault. A black man who is killed by the police for selling cigarettes on the corner is judged by his joblessness or past infractions against the law. In making the connections to stereotypes and who has the power to create these, there are levels of hegemonic privilege and control, so that even within an ethnicity, some have widespread influence. An example is when Italians denigrate the foodways of Italian Americans, arguing with contempt that the food is not Italian. That some of the food is not Italian in origin or practice is true, but that the food is bad or that Americans make bad food is only dependent on if the cook is a bad cook. Unless, of course, you're eating at Domino's Pizza, I think. But I saw a commercial here in Australia where Domino's was advertising something called authentic New Yorker range pizza, and one of the pizzas they were featuring was one that had big ham and pineapple. Don't see that too much in New York. This is why I suggest that hegemonic privilege forced upon us is not the only factor. There is also a self-created hegemonic perception to consider. Not only are there information and images mediated by those in control, the individual then processes these further. A stereotype threat arises when you're in a situation where you have a fear of doing something that would inadvertently confirm a negative stereotype. It is cued by the mere recognition that a negative group stereotype could apply to you in a certain situation. I do not have to accept that your perception of the world is the correct one, nor do I have to view myself reproachfully for not sharing these perceptions. Yet many people incorporate these negative perceptions into their construction of the self. This is the aim of those in control. It is not just that they are correct, you are wrong. When faced with an admonition of hegemonic privilege, a person might think that not only is it the case that the behavior is bad, but that you are a bad person because you are doing this. Going back to the food example, in the United States, there are often lists about what makes Americans such cretins when we go to Italy, because we do such things like putting grated cheese on seafood pasta, or we have cappuccino after noon. The person hearing this accepts these, even though it's part of hegemonic privilege. Therefore, I assume that they must know what's good, and therefore it must be wrong. Cognitive dissonance in psychology means having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes with regard to behavioral decisions. When this happens, it causes anxiety for us, and the anxiety has to be alleviated. Therefore, we have to either push that we're correct, or we have to assume the other person is correct. They can't both happen at the same time. When our fellow identity group members dress, talk, behave in ways that we do not accept as our own, then the derision comes from sources internal to the group as well as external. The issue for those within the group is one of identificational assimilation. Rather than challenge hegemonic privilege, some choose to take on the roles where control is exerted. This can be positive or negative. The self-hating ethnic wants to be like those in control by dissociating himself from the negatively viewed aspects within the culture of origin. This contributes to the fact that despite a rhetoric of diversity, most settings have failed in creating authentic inclusion. This is often a failure of leadership to sustain vigilance needed for change. This requires communicating a clear and uncompromising message from the top down that a situation must change. It means creating and implementing protocols that lead to the change and ensuring those practices are followed at every level. Institutions of higher education and corporations operate just as political and economic structures with regard to creating hegemonic privilege. This contributes to why it has been a difficult struggle to create programs and degrees in Italian diaspora studies. Creating new programs of studies means challenging the intellectual hegemony established by the elite institutions, so that scholars in any burgeoning field often have no voice or limited voice. New disciplines are treated like new immigrants. Leadership can make a pronouncement about diversity and inclusion, but without vigilance of oversight, nothing is going to change. At first glance, Italian Americans seem well adapted as a group, but once you take a closer look at the types of possible adaptation, it becomes evident that Italian Americans have succeeded or achieved in some areas, such as economic attainment, while failing in others, such as higher education. This is part of the reason why others do not believe that Italians are victims. They have a lot of money, they must be okay. They do not know the history of Italian immigrants, how they were treated, and especially their role in the early 20th century in the United States. Psychologists and sociologists have had to articulate more fluid models of ethnic identity development that relate to the degree and type of assimilation to multiple factors influencing adaptation to the majority group. The focus has tended to be on non-European immigrants in the United States and on Black Americans. For those with European ethnic origins, rather than discarding origin or remaining silent about it, self-proclaimed ethnicity is becoming increasingly highlighted as more recent groups come to the United States. To further complicate matters, while once being raised in a particular ethnic identity community determined your declared self-identity, now changing influences, media, diverse exposure is really leading to a way for the individual to create a self that is different from that community in which he or she grew up. Whether defining racial and ethnic identities is a benefit to the process of self-actualization is central in identity research, and it's something that we have to confront. My argument is that this has to be done first at the institutions of higher education, where we have diverse student bodies, but we don't necessarily have diverse faculties or diverse curricula. So to conclude, there is a need to reread the concept of cultural hegemony, including with Gramsci, with the aim of understanding that the individual has agency within a process of dualistic hegemonic perceptions. So to end with an exhortation from Gramsci, there is a need for organic intellectuals whose function in society is primarily that of organizing, administering, directing, or leading others to ameliorate the existing cultural hegemonies. One hopes that you're here in the room today. Thank you.